Hello, everyone. This is George Diaz, and I'm bringing you another episode of Let's Talk Community with George Diaz. Today, my guest is Gary Melling. Gary, how are you?
I'm doing well, George. Thanks for having me.
Oh, well, thanks for joining. I know you're busy. Now, Gary and I met through his business partner, Tracy Farber. Tracy and I go way back, and it might be as many as 10 years. We were part of a marketing automation group. It was a mastermind that was run by people that we knew in common. It was a way to learn what was then called Infusionsoft. It's the product that's now Keep. And in addition to learning a lot of the technical stuff, we learned a lot, or I learned a lot about how to run a business, because at the time I was just starting. I want to say that Tracy was a little farther along, and she provided me with an awful lot of great advice. So when I sent out a request for people who might be interested in speaking about community, she connected me up with Gary. And I wasn't sure exactly what we'd be talking about, but when we met, we did come up with something very different from what we've covered before. And Gary was more than grateful to come on with this. So, Gary, first introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your business, and then we'll kind of get into the discussion.
Thanks, George. Again, appreciate being here today. I probably have a little bit of a different background than most people. My father was a career military officer. I was born in Nova Scotia, Canada, but at 6 months of age, I was on a ship to live in England for about 5 years, and then we moved a little bit to France and Germany and back to England. Came back to Canada. I'm 66 years old, so in 1960 we came back to Canada, and I've been more or less living here ever since. But for example, just to show you how eclectic life was for us, we stopped counting. I was in 17 different schools. I spent, for example, grade 3 in 3 different schools in different provinces and, territories and so on. So we moved around so much, actually. It was at a point where we would move and often not really unpack everything. Just leave a lot of stuff in boxes, take out what we needed, and in 3 months we'd be moving again. So that's kind of how life was for me. But it was interesting that translated into my professional life from an organizational change management perspective. You have a lot of folks in business that are in organizational change management, and they've read good books and they have some good corporate experience. But I think what's really helped me a lot is the fact that the magnitude of the wholesale change that I've been involved in my whole life, whether it was intentional or by accident, has just been nonstop. So, I've been to, I tell people I've been to several universities. I graduated from a couple, but have really enjoyed post-secondary education. Having said that, as I always express to my kids, post-secondary education is at best, half of what you need in life. It's probably far less, because we know that travel and meeting people, having a sense of community, changing those communities, we all have different needs at different times. So that's been kind of an ongoing storyline in my life.
Well, I think that is, when someone says my background's probably different from most people, that's like a big statement, but you kind of convinced me there. I was a roommate to a guy in college who was a brat, but he was not nearly as moving around like you have been. And I would think some people would kind of come out of there probably traumatized, and apparently you've embraced that and even made it into a business.
Well, yes, you're right. A lot of people do come out of it traumatized. I've had several friends, especially not so much recently, but when I was much younger, and it's a sad comment, but the number of suicides amongst youth, dependent youth, it was something that took a while to get used to. I've had basically about a dozen school chums over the years that for one reason or another didn't feel that they could make the transition.
Oh, wow.
So it can be a very tough life, because you're a marginalized piece of subculture, if you will. You're not mainstream, and regardless of where you go, you're often you're labeled as that brat. It doesn't matter how nice you are, how good you are, anything else. You walk around with the moniker of being a brat. So it's very.
By the way, and that's a U.S. expression for Army brats, but
it's universal.
Yeah.
It really is. Yeah. And I understand how you mean it, and
Yeah.
I, totally fine with that. Yeah. So I guess, one of the things that, has translated, that experience has translated into my personal life and my professional life, is that for most people, when they're involved in a new situation, whether it's relevant to their family, to their business, or whatever, often they're staring at a white piece of paper. You have to create something. And for me, it's actually the most energizing thing I can walk into is a white piece of paper. When an organization says, well, it's a very ambiguous, it's a highly tumultuous corporate culture. I love that stuff, because that to me gives me so much opportunity to kind of find out what's really going on and find out what really needs to take place, and then create a bridge to get from where they are to where they want to be. So.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Well, good. That's interesting. I mean, I was, when I worked with change managers, I was usually the technology guy that came in behind them to establish infrastructures to support that. So I'm familiar with that. No one seemed to have as colorful a background as what you're describing. So why don't we jump into this, the community discussion that we came up with. And by the way, you told me about that without covering the background. So I'm learning this just as our listeners are. So why don't we have at it?
Sure, let's do it. So community, like I said, I think we all have different needs at different times, and that's personal, that's professional. I'm not the same person at 66 that I was at 56 or 46, et cetera. I mean, life hopefully has taught me a few lessons along the way. As we take a look at community, though, community is not, in my mind, it's not necessarily restricted to where you live or your family. It's this fluid matrix of relationships. And I find that a lot of times, especially in business, people talk about the work-life balance. And to me, that's a bit of a misnomer, because I think, in my mind, as I think of balance, I think of a teeter-totter. And it can be so precarious how you adjust the fulcrum point, where that fulcrum is, that if it's not done properly and with a lot of due diligence, it's very easy for things to go one way or the other. Whereas my approach is a little bit different. Rather than talking about balance, I talk about blending. So, for example, I'll try to blend, I'll use some of the disciplines from my professional life in my family environment. I'll use certain things from my family environment in my professional life, in working with people and change management and so on. So I think that if we treat it more as a blend versus something that is forced to be on a pivot, it makes it much easier for all of us. And I think of, prior to the call today, you and I were discussing with Tracy the whole notion of what's been happening in society recently. We've seen the last couple of years have been so tumultuous and so really hard, difficult. Our generation really hasn't seen anything like this. I mean, our parents' generation, my mother's 87. She lives with us. She's very bright and articulate and has all of her mental faculties. She's spot on. But she's been through, born in 34, she's been through the remnants of the Great Depression. She's been through the Second World War, the Korean War. She did serve. She was in the Air Force for a while, where she actually met my father. So, they've seen the booms and bust cycles of the Enrons and dot bombs and all the rest of it. And they're pretty much, I would say, bulletproof to anything that's going on. And so I think there are a lot of lessons that we can learn from the older generation. And I think our culture, unfortunately, has found a way to dismiss or to minimize the impact that seniors can have on helping people of all ages, especially younger, where they need maybe the story is old. But if we remember that the currency of very senior people is their stories, that's how they reflect and relate to the world. I think there are some gems that we can mine through those conversations and actually apply to our own lives. So community is all ages and stages and sizes and everything else. It's people from diverse walks of life and backgrounds and countries. And so I think
if we look at them as Venn diagrams, with intersections, and I'm kind of in the middle, and I'm probably a bigger part of some than others, but that doesn't preclude my wife from being very involved in some of my work things or, my church life, it's all intermingled where some are disjoint just because, they never meet, but that doesn't mean that I'm any less a part of that, right?
Correct. Correct. Yeah. I mean, like I said, when we all have different needs at different times, it's the same thing. I mean, think of it from a project management perspective. With your IT background, you think of the change management curve and the depths of despair and the whole idea of change management, trying to minimize the depth of the curve and get a project and an organization up to owning the project and being fully competent in administering and supporting that work internally. It's very similar, I think, in our personal lives. We may not view it that way. I know there are a lot of individuals in my different networks that have used the last 2 years to reflect on a lot of personal values, checking their moral compass, trying to establish. I had one friend who I was talking with last summer, and we were exchanging ideas on this whole pandemic situation. And he said to me, Gary, you're going to lose a lot of friends. And I said, well, I'm okay with that. We'll create new tribes. We'll be in a position where we network with, like-minded individuals. And, if it turns out that there are certain friendships that either fade away or are gone altogether, that's not a bad thing necessarily. And we want to free people up to pursue what it is resonates with them. So
you're saying that your circles kind of moved and some people moved out, not that some people died through the pandemic or anything.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So, we all have different news and views. I don't know how much we want to jump into particular points of view. For example, in our discussion last week, we were talking about, the vaxxed versus the unvaxxed, and is this really an issue of vaxxed versus unvaxxed, or is it more an issue of the right to choose? And, I have been vaccinated previously as a child, and I've received all my boosters along the way as a child. But this to me is something very, very different. This is an experimental gene therapy. And I think a lot of people have implicit trust in our governments. And there are times when that trust is well-founded. And I think there are times where certain issues come up that we at the very least need to really question what's going on. So just for the clarity for your audience, I am not an anti-vaxxer. I'm pro-choice as far as giving people the right to have the autonomy over their own body.
And what we had discussed before, because I didn't want this to be a them and us, vax versus not vax, but what we were thinking of really talking about is how polarized things get, where it's you versus us, them. Mm-hmm. And then because your opinion is different from mine, I either cut you off, I ostracize you, or I encourage my tribe to say, hey, those are bad guys.
Mm-hmm. So true. So true. And I think we lose so much opportunity to understand different points of view when we become almost militant in thinking that our view is the only view.